The next paradigm in machine learning is semi-supervised learning. The problem is stated as follows. We have a labeled data D sub L, where the labels are, for example, class numbers, and unlabeled data D sub U. Usually the amount of unlabeled data is much more than for labeled data. And there are two objectives. The first is to construct a classification algorithm that can be used to predict class labels for other data that is not the data from D sub L, neither D sub U. It's really the same objective as in supervised learning. And the second objective is to predict the labels for instances from D sub U only. In this case, the semi-supervised learning is called as transductive learning. It seems that the second objective is a particular case of the first one. Because if we have a classification algorithm, we can apply it to any data, including the data from D sub U. And in this case, and in this way, to solve the second objective. It's true, but if we need to predict labels from D sub U only, then we don't have to worry about the generalization capabilities of the model. We know a priori the data for which the model will be applied. And as a result, some specific approaches can be used in the transductive learning. For the first objective, one can notice that if we solve the classification problem, why do we need the unlabeled data D sub U at all? The answer is shown in these illustrations. The classification problem in semi-supervised learning is not the same as it is in pure supervised learning. For example, if we have only labeled data, as it's shown in the top left figure, and we apply some supervised learning algorithm, for example, support vector machine, obtain the solution shown in the bottom left figure. But if we also have unlabeled data, as it's shown in the top right figure, then the solution can be different. Because in spite of the unknown labels, we can suggest them for some data, and these suggestions can change the solution. The result of semi-supervised classification is shown in the bottom right figure. On the other hand, if we solve the unsupervised learning problem, for example clustering, the presence of labeled data also can change the solution. The results of pure unsupervised clustering are shown in the bottom left figure. But if we perform clustering in presence of labeled data, we obtain the results shown in the bottom right figure. The reason is that we suggest that the data with the same label more probably should belong to the same cluster. The next machine learning paradigm is ensemble learning. The problem is the same as it's in supervised or unsupervised learning, but we try to construct not the only one model, but many different models called weak models, each of which needs to be very accurate. And then we try to combine these weak models into the complex one called ensemble or model committee to boost the accuracy. It can be shown that under certain conditions, the committee will have the accuracy higher than each of the weak models. There are many approaches in ensemble learning. It's Bayesian voting, manipulating with training sample, features or outputs. Some models, for example random forest, manipulate with training sample and features at the same time. The next interesting paradigm is reinforcement learning. It's rather different from others. Here, the model called agent interacts with its environment and learns how to do it better. The agent's objective is to act in the environment so as to maximize some long-term cumulative reward. The problem in reinforcement learning is how to estimate this long-term reward. Like in the real life, sometimes it's difficult to predict what consequences will have some of our actions in the long term. The action can have instant reward, but in the future it can lead to some loss, or vice versa. Like in games like chess, we can beat the queen, but the next step lose the game. Or in order to win ultimately, we need sometimes to sacrifice. The agent in reinforcement learning interacts with the environment and receives rewards or penalties from it. It's similar to how children learn. They accumulate the experience and finally understand which consequences will have actions without even performing them. In reinforcement learning, the neural networks are actively used to predict long-term rewards of actions that should be taken in the given states of environment. The next paradigm is active learning. In the active learning, like in semi-supervised learning, we have unlabeled data and labeled data. The amount of labeled data is usually small because the labeling is a cost and sometimes time-consuming procedure performed by a human called oracle. So we mostly have unlabeled data, but we also have a possibility to query labels for some data if needed. The problem in active learning can be, for example, classification, but at the same time we try to minimize the amount of queries to the oracle. In mathematical statistics, active learning is known as optimal experimental design. And the most prominent paradigm nowadays is deep learning. The models used in deep learning are deep neural networks, such as convolutional neural networks, deep belief networks, deep recurrent neural networks, for example, long short-term memory networks and others. Deep learning is based on learning data representations. For example, for convolutional neural network that can consist of tens of layers and used for image classification, the first layer receives pixel intensities of the image and produces as a result of learning some features, for example, related to some strokes or lines or circles in the origin image. The next layer receives this new representation of the origin image in terms of these primitive geometric figures and constructs the new representation that's already representation of representation, and so on. Each subsequent layer constructs more high-level representation, and the features at the output layer can be related, for example, to face or car signs or trees and so on. So what does the deep neural network actually do? It constructs the features useful to the given problem. In the classic machine learning pipeline, it had to do the researcher. And the feature engineering is a difficult problem that requires data understanding, mathematical background, and knowledge in the problem area. And usually it's performed by a highly experienced professional. But with the deep neural network, we don't need to construct the features at all. We give the origin data or simply preprocessed data to the model's input, and we expect that the network will learn the features. As soon as the features are learned, they go to the classifier or some other supervised or unsupervised machine learning model. So, the convolutional neural network joins two stages of the machine learning pipeline. That's feature extraction and learning algorithm into one model. With deep learning, it's highly related another paradigm of machine learning called transfer learning. The idea of transfer learning is to apply the model trained for one problem to a different but related problem. For example, if we trained a convolutional neural network on the large training data set, we expect that its first layers are learned to represent the images well. That's in the form useful for classification. And suppose we have another classification problem, and we ask yourself, should these learned features be useful for our problem too? If these problems, namely the problem that the network was trained to and our problem are similar, we can expect that the learned representation would work for our problem too. The examples of these problems could be classification of handwritten digits and classification of handwritten letters, for example. So, in transfer learning, we take the first layers of the trained deep neural network to produce the features, and then train some supervised model, for example a shallow multi-layer neural network, to classify them. In practice, it can be implemented as follows. We take the trained deep neural network as is and retrain only its last layers.